there was approximately 85 different partners that Sdtc worked with. And so those partners would nominate companies for funding. And then those nominations would go through an eligibility screening process. And so a nomination
I've read the documents. That wasn't my question. My question was that you had accelerators set up to review these things. Did you not? Like the Fisherin Center?
No, it was staff that would review the projects for eligibility. And then had they met the eligibility criteria that was set up for the seed funding stream, the companies would then go forward to a panel of experts that would review them. Then the recommendations would be made to the project review committee. The project review committee would then recommend projects to the board of directors.
Okay. Who did you report to?
I reported to the former CEO, Leah Lawrence.
So you worked then in parallel with the current acting COO, whatever they're calling him, Zaid, the former or VP of Investments?
Sorry, is that a question?
Yeah. So you worked with parallel? Is that correct?
Oh, yes, yes. So Ziad Rami was my peer, and he held the role of Vice President Investment.
Right. So there are a number of emails when the consideration was being put forward for $6.8 million for the Fisherin Center from the board. There are a number of emails from him to the team, which I think includes you, fast-tracking their application. In fact, on July 30th, 2021, the subject says, Fisherin Center request to fast-track proposal. So who would have told him to fast-track that proposal?
So, oh gosh. So I guess your question is, who would have told him to fast track? I would expect, I'm trying to remember because I know Ziad addressed this at the committee before. So there's about 6 steps in the application process. So a fast track would be that the information collected on the project was sufficient and they didn't need to gather additional information on the project.
He makes the determination to fast track it.
That would be the decision of the Vice President Investment, who would agree to fast track it. But it doesn't necessarily mean the project moves faster through the approval process. It just means that there's sufficient information to proceed to the next step.
Fair enough. So the Fisherin Center was turned down for obvious conflicts of interest. It's shocking to me that it ever made it anywhere, even through a consideration process. It was turned down. But the same Vice President, in a letter in January 2022, said that they would use staff at Sdtc to find money elsewhere in the government. Do you think it's the right thing it was the right thing for the employees of Sdtc to essentially be the business development arm, finding government money for a center which was set up by the chair of the board?
It's my understanding that the Fisherin Center asked Sdtc to not support them in finding any additional funding streams after their project was denied.
Not what happened.
It was never fun.
But that's not what happened. That's not what happened. According to the Vice President of Investments, yes, they did, in fact, help find them almost $11 million. Was that a regular occurrence where board member companies were being used or helped by staff to find other government funding for their projects?
So as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I worked with a team of ecosystem leads, and their mandate was to support.
Well, yes or no. It's a simple yes or no. I don't need a repeat of your opening remarks. Yes or no. Did board member companies that they had investments in regularly use the staff of Sdtc to find other government money for their companies? Yes or no?
So what I was trying to answer is that the team at Sdtc always put support for companies as the primary focus of the work that they did. If that meant a company was not a fit for SDTC's mandate, they would make recommendations based on their knowledge of the ecosystem of other places where companies could go to receive funding. So that was part of the work that the ecosystems team would do.
Thank you very much. That is your time, Mr. Perkins. Next is Ms. Yip.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms. Kobach, for coming today. How many employees were you responsible for under your team?
That would change over time. So approximately, I'd say about 10 employees.
And
It might not be exactly right.
Okay, and why would that change?
Just as if I took on additional responsibilities or if we recruited additional people to support the work that the foundation was doing. I was there for 8 years, so over time there was different structures.
Okay. How would you describe your leadership style during your time at Sdtc?
You know, one of the things is some of the feedback I'll get from my team is often I have a genuine caring of the people within my team. I would describe my leadership style as very empathetic, kind, supportive, as well as high performing. So I would always have high expectations for the team that I led, but would certainly want to ensure that they had support they needed to achieve the goals that they had in front of them. I'm very clear in my communication to them. I'm accessible should they need to speak with me. Those would be attributes of my leadership style that I always held in every leadership role I've been given.
So I take note of the qualities you've just mentioned, but it's also noted from many employees that there was significant staff turnover during the tenure of Leah Lawrence as president and CEO. Would you say that this is accurate?
So what I would say is in any organization, there is turnover, and the foundation did track those turnover rates, and they were within kind of the industry averages. I also believe that there was a review of retention rates within the McCarthy Tetra report. I seem to recall that I read that, and they were deemed to be within acceptable or normal ranges of turnover.
In your opening statement, you said you were surprised and saddened by the allegations from former staff or staff.
It was very sad to hear the allegations brought forward, because I've always strived to foster an inclusive and supportive workplace and to ensure that everyone's voices are heard and that people feel respected. So the allegations are very much not in line with the values that I have as a leader.
How would you compare your view of your leadership style with statements from multiple former employees saying that Sdtc had a toxic culture and workplace environment during the tenure of Leah Lawrence as president and CEO?
I would say that those don't align with the vast majority of employees at the foundation today.
What about in the past?
I would not say that that was the experience, and I would just have to ask you to look at, there was a very thorough and comprehensive report of all of the allegations that were brought forward. And the conclusions of that report talk about, that was a view of a minority of people.
Well, these same former employees have alleged incidents of verbal abuse and public shouting. And how do you respond to these claims?
I do not shout. I do not shout at my children in my home. I do not shout at my employees at the workplace. The voice and the tone and the tenor that I'm using with you today is consistent with how I operate in a professional environment as well.
So, a former project manager at Sdtc stated that nothing about working within or around this organization gives me the confidence that the individuals in management would admit to problems if they were found. Why would a former employee so publicly criticize the organization like this?
I'm not certain why a former employee made those statements, but what I can say is that employee, along with all employees, TTC, and all former employees, were invited to fully participate in the review of HR practices that was commissioned by the Minister of Innovation and Science, supported by the Department of Justice. People were invited to speak freely in that review, and the conclusions on those matters are contained in those reports that are on the public record.
So there are also claims that employees experienced a hostile work environment under your leadership. So were you aware of any concerns raised by staff about workplace culture?
I became aware, just give me a minute here, please, of the allegations against me when I began receiving anonymous emails, fraudulent emails that had been established in my name that contained many of the allegations that you were quoting today. That was how I was first informed of the allegations it made against me. It was very upsetting for me. I have never had anyone take my name and create anonymous email to be able to communicate broadly and publicly all of these allegations. Just take a minute.
Just maybe have a glass of water?
Yeah, I'll do that. I'm ready for the next question.
All right,
Okay,
Ms.
so-
Chip, I'm afraid that is your
Oh.
time, and I was going to ask the same thing of
Okay.
the witness. Our second round, which will be 6 minutes of various time. Mr. Cooper, you're going to lead us off for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Ms. Colbuck, I'm going to ask you some questions with respect to the application for funding by the Verscheren Center. When the decision was made not to move ahead with the funding application, the then VP of Investments and current COO, Mr. Rami, on January 18, 2022, wrote to the Verscheren Center and stated that Sdtc would give best efforts to help the Verscheren Center secure funding from other government departments and agencies, notwithstanding the obvious conflict of interest that Annette Verscheren was chair of Sdtc and at the same time was the founder of and sat on the board of directors of the Verscheren Center. It was her personal vanity project. So who was it, whose decision ultimately was it to direct staff to undertake efforts for the Verscheren Center to receive government funding from other departments and agencies?
So as I responded earlier, I did kind of look up that email that you had mentioned and subsequent emails. And, you know, just to remind myself, it was a while ago and I was unfortunately experiencing an episode of long COVID, which had me not at work in part of that time period. But what I do recall is that the Verscheren Center had actually asked Sdtc to not support them in finding funding after receiving news that their project with Sdtc was not going to be moving forward.
Well, that's inconsistent with the testimony of Mr. Rami, who wrote the letter on January 18th, and when he was asked about it, he conceded, or based on his testimony, that efforts were made. Why wouldn't he have said that no efforts were made if, in fact, that were the case?
I mean, when you're at these committees, there's many, many questions coming at you. You're trying to remember quite an expanded period of time. We certainly, based on that email that you shared, the offer would have been made, but whether or not the offer was accepted, it's my recollection that it was not accepted for Sdtc to provide support to that center.
And on what basis do you draw that recollection? Was there a letter? What communications were there between the Verscheren Center and with whom? What do you have to substantiate that? Because it's completely inconsistent with what we've heard.
Yeah, I can look and see what I can do to further substantiate that and follow up with the committee with that information.
Now, it also contradicts the testimony of the whistleblower who stated that unprecedented efforts were made to help secure funding for the Verscheren Center. So are you stating to this committee that the whistleblower misled or flat out lied to this committee? Is that your position?
My goal of this committee is to ensure that I provide fulsome responses to the questions I'm being asked based on my recollection of what happened at the time, because I know this matter is of utmost interest to this committee, and I want to ensure that I fulfill my duty and roles in responding to all of the questions that you were putting forward with the most fulsome answer that I can.
Thank you for that. And I want to go back to a question that Mr. Perkins posed to you, and that is, how often did Sdtc staff assist board members, companies, or projects in which board members had interests in to secure funding from other government departments and agencies, as Mr. Rami offered to do on behalf of the Verscheren Center? How often did that happen?
So I was never contacted by any board member about a project that was being considered for funding. What I did provide in my response to your colleague was that Sdtc did, and my employees and the staff at Sdtc did work within that whole of government approach to providing support for clean technology companies. So we would make referrals to other funding agencies, other programs, provincial partners.
And sorry to interrupt, those referrals happened in certain instances where board members had conflicts. They were board members' companies. They had interest in those companies. Sdtc staff, you're confirming, did assist projects where there were those types of conflicts. Is that correct?
So I'm based in Calgary, Alberta, right? So oftentimes there might be an applicant that was looking for funding, and the project that they had could have been a better fit for a program under Natural Resources Canada. So we would, make a referral.
I understand in general, but I'm asking just a very specific question, and I would like an answer, yes or no.
That is your time. Mr. Cooper, that is your time. We will come back to you, I am sure.
We now have Ms. St. Clair for 2.5 minutes, please. Okay, I will continue with my previous questions. The Department of Innovation, and we see this in the AG's report, that there were several warnings as to the incompatibility of the seed funding and the ecosystem. You were the director who was choosing the projects to be funded. So how can you explain that you simply decided to ignore the concerns of the department who is funding you, in fact?
So I always believed that Sdtc was operating within the confines of our mandate and the agreement with, we did have regular discussions and reporting of our work with department officials. Decisions related to project funding were made by the former board of directors. And so I always believed, I also acknowledge that the Auditor General has come to a different conclusion and accept all of the recommendations.
D'accord, merci beaucoup.
Okay, thank you very much. So are you telling me that you weren't aware of the concerns that the Minister of Innovation had and that this person had sent concerning the fund that you directed? You were never informed of the minister's concerns?
May I just get you to clarify your question, the minister's concerns?
Je ne parle pas directement du ministère, mais du ministère.
I'm talking about not the minister, but the department concerns. So the Auditor General, and I'm sure you've read the report. I don't need to reread in my limited time. the paragraph in question, but it states clearly and categorically that the Minister of Innovation had, or the department rather, had raised concerns about non-compliance with the fund that you were directing. So the same question I'm asking for the second time, are you telling me that you were not aware of the department's concerns?
What I had regular discussions and with officials within the Department of Innovation and Science. Any concerns that they had, I would have addressed and felt that they were addressed in my discussions with them. These projects were publicly reported on. They
Ouais,
were
bon, en même temps,
and believed to be within our mandate. And so...
ben alors, vous connaissez pas le mandat de TDDC.
Well, then you're not aware of the mandate of Sdtc, because you know that a project, that the submissions had to be public, up on the internet. You have to see how that you can apply for the seeding fund or the ecosystem fund. You should have known as well that there were conflicts of interest. Now, you referred to the board, but a conflict of interest in your eyes, you didn't report the correct information to the project review committee. And they were stakeholders. There were people who were receiving funding. You didn't give that information about concerning the conflict of interest to the board. And on top of that, the contribution agreement was not complied with. So, Ms. Kolbeck, it seems that there are things that really don't work. And you're still in your job, which is astonishing.
Est-ce que je peux avoir une explication?
Could I have an explanation, please?
There wasn't, it was more of a statement. Madame Colbeck, as-tu des commentaires?
J'ai demandé de m'expliquer.
Do you have a comment, Ms. Kolbeck?
Comment.
I'm sure Madame Secretary will pick it up again on her next turn.
Thanks for joining us. It's nice to see someone from Alberta, even if you are from Calgary. I want to ask, were you aware of these conflicts that were going on? Like, it was systemic. It wasn't like one or two that governance missed. Like, this was widespread systemic fraud being committed. You were a vice president, so high level. Were you aware of any of these?
So how I would be made aware is if there was a conflict declared, then I would be
And
aware.
ask that, were you aware of these conflicts?
So I was aware that there were conflicts that some board members had because they were
And what
declared
did you do with that?
So in my role as the Vice President Ecosystems, I always did my best to manage these conflicts of interest and to ensure that the stewardships of public funds was done in the best way possible.
Were you aware that in the contribution agreement it was required that the foundation report conflicts or perceived conflicts to the ministry or to the minister?
Yes, I was aware of that, and it was my understanding that there was a departmental liaison who had access to the board materials, including the minutes.
Right.
And
So
the conflicts would have been
let me just ask again. So you were aware that they were required to be reported to the minister. Did you ever follow up on any of those to ensure that these conflicts were addressed?
I appreciate the question from the honourable member. It was not my responsibility to report those
I'm sorry.
conflicts.
You were a vice president, probably a public service, well-compensated vice president, and you didn't believe it was your job to report these. We had a whistleblower, and I'm sure you've read the testimony because you reported on it. He was not a high-level senior executive like yourself, but he had the bravery to come forward and try and stop this fraud. But yourself as a vice president, you didn't see it as your responsibility to follow up on this? Help me out here. Like,
It was my understanding these conflicts were reported into the department by us providing them with copies of the minutes of the board meetings, the materials from the board meetings.
Fraud went on for years. You just turned a blind eye. So you were aware. You said, okay, well, we reported it through minutes, but it continued for years. 400 million stolen from taxpayers. And yet, as a vice president, you did your job by sending along an email or sending along minutes and then walking away. Like, I'm just flabbergasted how this could happen. Well, I guess I don't have an answer.
I'm sorry,
You
I
said
didn't,
that
I didn't
you-
hear a question. Was
Okay,
there a
I'm
question?
flabbergasted. How did you allow that to happen? Like, in what world does a vice president, a well-paid, well-compensated, well-pensioned vice president, not take any responsibility when taxpayers' money is being defrauded? I could see one off. If it happened once, okay, I saw the minutes went up the line, but this went on for years. Millions stolen for years. And you were aware, and you were a vice president, but it was like a shrug. Sir, I don't think I'm going to get a response. I'm going to turn my final minute over to Ms. Sinclair Dignay.
Très bien, vous avez 1 minute 4 secondes, s'il vous plaît.
Je vous donne.
I'll give you another opportunity to answer the question. And I'll continue in the same vein as what Mr. McCauley has been asking. Not only did you not report either to the board or to the department these conflicts of interest, you were part of it because you yourself was hiring Mr. Wormold to do the assessments on applications that he himself had written. So do you not understand what a conflict of interest is? I'm asking you a clear question. Do you understand what a conflict of interest is?
Oui ou non?
Yes or no?
I certainly have strengthened my understanding of conflict of interest.
Quand vous avez
to
été
ensure
engagé en
that I
2016, est-ce que quand vous avez été engagé en 2016,
When you were hired in 2016, did you follow conflict of interest training? Did you follow the training? Did you take it?
Yes, I would have familiarized myself with the conflict
donc, vous
of
n'aviez
interest
pas
policy
compris
upon joining the organization.
avant le rapport de la
And so before the Auditor General's report, you hadn't understood what conflict of interest was, even though you followed the training? It seemed normal to you that a person draft an application and then go over to Sdtc to assess that same application? Does that seem normal to you? And not reporting this kind of behavior to the board so that the board approved the project without knowing that there was a huge conflict of interest within that project, does that seem normal to you?
So I'm going to have to say, like, all of these matters were thoroughly reviewed by the Auditor General. They've made a number of recommendations to strengthen the conflict of interest practices at Sdtc. The Foundation has accepted all of those recommendations, and I'm certainly following the policies and practices that are in place.
Thank you.